Hi, welcome back to another video that we're producing within the Propeller Club of Geneva. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the bunker quality issues after the IMO 2020 regulations. This is a subject which is impacting a lot of people in the market, and we're hoping to look at different angles. So we're joined today by three very knowledgeable speakers, and I'd like to give them a chance to introduce themselves. We have, on one side, we have Rustin joining us from Euronav, we have Chris who's joining us from Brookes Bell, and we have Caroline who's joining us from UK Defence. So just very quickly to introduce yourselves and let our audience have an idea of your expertise. Can I pass it over to you, Rustin, first? Give us a few words about yourself.
Good morning. My name is Rustin Edwards. I'm head of fuel procurement for Euronav, based in Geneva. I've got 20 years experience in fuel oil trading, markets, bunker fuel management, and blending.
Thank you, Rustin. And can I pass it on to Chris? Tell us a few words about yourself.
Hi, Chris Fisher. I work for Brookes Bell consultancy company. My key work is in bunker claims. I act as an expert in court and arbitrations, and I'm appointed by all sorts of people, quite independent. I can work for ship owners, bunker suppliers, P&I clubs, whoever.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And Caroline.
Hello, my name is Caroline Avgerinou. I am the syndicate manager of Thomas Miller Hellas, based in Greece. And I have 20 years experience in shipping. And early last year, I became a member of a specialist IMO 2020 sulfur group in order to be in a position to prepare our members for what was to come with the new regulations.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I think that you all have very interesting things to share with us. So IMO 2020 was the big topic this time last year, running up to the end of 2019. This was the topic. There were people saying that this was going to be the biggest change in shipping since we moved from sail power over to coal. I think that the impact has been very different from what was expected. I think also the epidemic, COVID epidemic, has had a huge impact on the world's markets, which has then changed significantly the impact of the IMO 2020 regulations. In a nutshell, IMO 2020 is the regulations to reduce the sulfur content in fuel oil, which we're using to power ships around the world. And so basically what we're going to do is we're going to start off by having a few initial thoughts from our three guests today. And so the logic is that we're going to start with Rustin from Euronav to look at it more from a user point of view. Then we're going to move over to Chris from Brookes Bell to look at it, actually looking at the specific bunkers themselves and their quality. And then we're going to hear from Caroline, who's dealing on the claim side, and hear about some of the problems that we've been encountering. So first of all, let me pass it over to you, Rustin. Can you give us your first comments on this particular subject?
Well, it has been an interesting year in that the concerns that the shipping industry had around IMO 2020, i.e. the availability and the quality of the fuel, have been ironed out for the most part. On the availability side, stocks are relatively available in most markets. Haven't heard of any issues of runouts or any stockouts or lack of supply when a ship pulls into a port. So the refining systems and the traders and the bunker suppliers have been very good by getting the right stocks in the right markets to meet the needs of the shipping industry. I think the most interesting facet that's happened, however, has been the quality issues that have been popping up. And this has to deal with the fact that there's a lot more material available to blend into a 0.5 fuel than there was available into a high sulfur fuel. Part of the reason that is that VLSFO is a positive margin product when you look at it from a refinery perspective, which means that anything has the ability to go into that pool as long as the price differentials as that creates a blend margin for that material. I think one of the biggest aspects is that when you look at it from a refinery, that when gasoline margins are low, refineries will like to slack their FCC units, which increases their availability of low sulfur VGO, which is a high paraffinic product. And now the refinery has a place to put that material. They can put it into the bunker pool, which has a steady demand profile, probably much more steady than gasoline demand in some points. And that creates a wider availability of blend stocks, which then have their own quality issues that haven't been experienced in the past. One of the issues that we do see as an end user, and it's something that's not relatively addressed in the ISO 8217 specification, is the fact that high wax fuel do cause operational issues on ships. We have experienced that ourselves. We've heard of other shipping companies that have experienced that. And it basically, those issues of high wax, high paraffinic material come into play when gasoline margins are low. And we saw a lot of that during the height of the COVID pandemic, lock-ins and gasoline margins falling off, and more availability of these gasoline feedstocks being pushed into the bunker pool because it's still fairly steady in relation to the gasoline demand profile. So I think that's something that is still going to be with us for a while, because as all these other components start making their way into the VLSFO pool, the experience in blending them and how to handle them on a ship are not there. So it is still a learning curve that's still going through in the shipping industry of how to handle high paraffinic material, as well as other high aromatic materials that haven't before been in the bunker pool in the past.
Thanks, Rustin. It's always interesting when you give me an answer. I find that I can ask you any question, and your answer is much more complicated than I can fully digest. But we're going to get back into a couple of those issues in a minute, because there are a couple of things I want to go into, talking about the availability, but also talking about how you're handling that, and also where this wax is coming from and how to deal with it. I'd like to move over to Chris, and so if you can give your opening thoughts where you see things at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, when we came into 2020, I was sort of thinking, well, what are we going to see in quality issues? I thought we'd see less catalytic fines, which has turned out to be true. I thought that perhaps fuels would be more paraffinic, which leads on to the wax issue that Rustin mentioned. But I thought overall we'd probably be in better shape than when using high sulfur fuel. But as the year kicked in, we ran immediately into problems with what appeared to be instability or dirty fuel. And I remember talking to the club back in February, I think it was, and I said, well, I think all this will go away once ships' tanks get cleaned up and barges have got rid of their previous residues and so on. And to some extent, it did go away. But then we ran into the cold property issues. The fuels that we're receiving now, of course, are far different, much lower viscosity than traditional high sulfur fuels. Which is not a bad thing. It requires less heating on board. But the measure for cold property pour point became a bit of an issue, because we found that some fuels began to precipitate wax at a much lower temperature than we'd had in the past. And pour point, we used to think, well, if we keep the fuels around 10 degrees C above the pour point, we should disperse wax. But that's not been the case on quite a number of fuels, and ships have run into problems with blocking of centrifuges, particularly at the lower temperatures. So that's something. It seems to have eased off a bit, but it's something that we'll have to keep in mind. Really, it's about management on board, but knowing the cold properties of the fuel. We've had some issues on flashpoint. And that's been suggested, well, maybe there's some problem with too much jet fuel being around with us not traveling these days. And some of that product may be somehow finding its way into blend stocks. The stability problem has come back more recently, and that's more worrying. It seems that fuels as delivered may well meet the ISO 8217 total sediment maximum of 0.1%. But when they've been on board for a few weeks, the fuels seem to deteriorate. And that suggests that they have a poor shelf life. Not all of them, but some of them. Which makes claims kind of difficult, because we have a test of the fuel going on board saying it's fine. And then we have the ship with sludge pouring out the purifiers saying it's not fine. And we carry out tests from in-tank samples and find quite a different situation to the fuel as supplied. It's a bit worrying. That's carrying on a bit. We're still having problems. Some ships have tried additives. They've worked in some cases, but certainly not in all cases. More recently, we've had problems with contaminants coming back in. Those in the industry will remember perhaps 2018 when we had what we called the Houston affair, with lots of bio-type waste in fuels which cause seizure of fuel pumps and so on. And that's popped up again. It's not really saying it's very low sulfur fuel oil. It's a contamination problem that could happen to any fuel. And there's obviously something's happening in the supply chain that should not be happening. So we've got quite a mixed bunch. I would say in general that the claims are probably lower than previously, but they're more complex and they're sometimes difficult to understand. I mean, I only get involved in bunker fuel when it's a problem. And you have to keep in mind that 99.9%, I would think, of fuels delivered to ships is perfectly fine, fit for use. But I get the tiny bit where problems are being reported. So there is an issue, ongoing issue. It's not peculiar to low sulfur fuel, and that's sampling. We often have differences between the supplier issued samples, tests on those, and tests on ship taken samples, quite different results. And that go back to a fundamental, I think for 30, 40 years, I've been talking about proper sampling, and we still seem to have a problem. So that makes claims very difficult to get through. And I'm sure that Caroline will talk about charterer's position in the chain. It's kind of difficult with a supply contract, quite different to a charter party, fighting through the battle of the samples. So I think that's where we are at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. I think there are an awful lot of points that I'd love to dive into there. Certainly looking at the potential guarantees which might be given by the suppliers, the difficult situation those suppliers are in, but also hearing about some of these, how the claims have changed so radically. We'll go into those in a little bit in a moment. It's also interesting how you say that a lot of the 99% of the issues that you deal with are obviously the problems, and those problems probably represent a very, very small percentage of the overall use of these products in the market. And that's something that we also need to keep in mind. So we're going to get back to a lot of those points in a minute. In the meantime, I'd like to carry on to Caroline, talking from the claims point of view, if you give us your initial thoughts.
Thank you very much. Well, from the claims point of view, I think this all started for us, like many others, long before the regulations actually came into force. So, as I mentioned when I introduced myself, we had dedicated teams in our offices who became specialists in IMO 2020 sulfur issues. And we had scientists, and indeed we had some scientists from Brookes Bell, who prior to COVID, they were able to visit our office and give us demonstrations on how you look at fuel, what can happen in terms of a poor quality fuel, how that can affect a vessel, how it can affect the main engine, steps that the crew can take on board in terms of sampling, the correct way to sample, or the preferred way rather is a better term. So we did a lot of prep on that prior to the regulations coming into force. And then following on from that prep, what we did is we went around to various owners' offices and we sat down with them. And in many cases, we looked at their existing charter parties and we looked at the clauses that they had within those charters and the intended clauses they had in respect of both the transition period and the period after March, so when they would have to use compliant fuel fully. And we examined those clauses and suggested ways in which they could change those clauses slightly in order to make their position more favourable, in order to try to cover them where possible in terms of claims that could come down the line. And I think that this step, it's very important to highlight that we did this, because this made a massive difference in terms of the number of claims that we received once the regulations came into force. This is both in reference to the first 3 months and thereafter, because we certainly saw less claims. And we also had owners who knew exactly how to interpret clauses. So while there may have been some issues, they actually never came near us because they were so well informed at that stage, having had demonstrations similar to the ones we were given by scientists in terms of fuel itself, but also having had legal input as to the interpretation and the actual practice of the clauses, and linking that up in effect with the practical element which Chris has just discussed. And one issue, for example, that we would have looked at with owners in particular was the sampling, and what your preferred sampling methods should be in order to cover you. You don't just be using charge party clauses where you commit to the supplier's sample being the ruling sample, for example. That would be a big no-no. You definitely don't want to go down that road. So little things like that made a massive difference, I think, in how the claims developed. So once we actually got into 2020, I think the transition, it was definitely a lot smoother than expected, but it wasn't without its challenges. There was definitely issues coming up that we hadn't thought of. Nobody had thought of. Or you had issues sometimes where the owner's sample showed the fuel off spec, the supplier's sample was on spec. The charter was pressing the owner to use the fuels, and you've got an on spec fuel. What's your problem? The owner said, no, it's off spec. I'm not using this. I might damage my main engine. And then they would come along to the club or to their local lawyer and say, what do we do? We are, at a standoff here. We seem to be between a rock and a hard place. We need input. How should we handle these kinds of situations? So we would get very involved then, and we would also have somebody like Chris in the background from the science side in also advising owners. So we would combine the two, the legal and the practical, to give a solution, a viable solution, and not just simply for owners, but also for charters, because they were also in a rather precarious position, one could say, at that time. They wanted the vessel to just get moving. There's a cargo on that vessel. It's under a sales contract. It needs to move. So everybody wanted it to move along. So a swift solution was preferred in those kinds of situations. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that 2020 has definitely not been without its challenges. Many cases have come in, slightly different in nature in some respects as to what was expected. I would say the beginning of 2020, we saw more cases where we saw a little off-spec fuel in terms of sulfur. And then as the year moved on, it was more looking at the TSP. That was what was coming off spec. So there was a change in the way the cases moved. Nowadays, we see less cases where it's the sulfur that's off spec, but we're still kind of on the same level as in the number of cases. It's just that something else is off spec now. So, you have to change, I think, your viewpoint in terms of what you've got in front of you as to how you handle each particular case. So that's kind of what we've been experiencing so far.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Caroline. Some very, very interesting points you make there, and it must be quite complicated in your particular position, because obviously you have clients who are ship owners and also charterers, and so you have to be able to consider both points of view. I'm going to come back to that in a second. I'd like to go over to Rustin again. Rustin, you were talking about the difficulty of these particular stocks and the bunkers that you were purchasing. How do you go about ensuring the right quality? I mean, is it just a question of choosing the right suppliers, and are there certain trusted suppliers, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, I mean, from a ship owner perspective, we do try to make sure that the suppliers that we choose our frontline producers of the fuel and not so much a third-party intermediary between us and the fuel producer. The less hands you're touching the blends, the better off you are, because everybody wants to extract as much margin as they can from every sale. And so, it reduces your risk if you try to be more direct with the producer versus being a trader. Now, in some markets, that's not possible or not very plausible, because there are no refiners in markets that we may go load or we may bunker, and so you end up doing interacting with third-party suppliers who are not necessarily the producers or the blender of the oil. So at that point, it just becomes down a point of diligence on looking at the quality that's provided and looking for points that could indicate problems. Part of the stability issues that we've seen is that people are not blending material in the right fashion. You can blend oil, and oil can adhere because you have created density differentials that are too wide that make a fuel proponent to stratify and fall apart. Conversely, also, you can watch how much aromatic material you put into a blend versus paraffinic material, which would reduce the TSP fallout that can happen. So these are things that we look at as we buy fuel. We always want to see the quality of the fuel being provided as best we can. If we do see fuel that has some tracers that we've identified as potential points to watch, i.e. high core point material, we do see a lot more core points that are at 28, 27, 30 degrees, which is usually indicative of more paraffinic material being put into the mix. We also try to look at where the viscosity versus the densities are sitting, because that can give an indication as to how poorly mixed the oil is, or if they're using too many materials that are too widely dispersant in density, which can cause stability issues and stratification if it's around too long.
Thank you, Rustin. As always, you have such a high level of knowledge that you go into a lot of detail when you give these kind of answers, but I always very much enjoy them. You're talking about issues with blending. Is this because of potentially a lack of technical knowledge, a lack of experience, or is it cutting corners?
Well, I think it's a matter that people were focusing more on hitting a sulfur spec than hitting a quality spec. And when you start focusing on a certain quality point that you want to hit, you're putting a lot of cats and dogs together to make that sulfur spec happen. I think it's also a fact that there's a lot more available components that can be used to make a VLSFO blend than there were for high sulfur. Because again, VLSFO is a positive margin product. So when you have a positive margin product, you can put all sorts of things from a refinery and still make money blending. You can put higher sulfur material, higher aromatic material, or in this market today, jet fuel has made its way into blends. I've seen people put bits of naphtha into a blend. VGO, again, these are all high value products that have a higher uplift material in a refinery, but when the margins aren't there, they become available to the general market, and people find out how to place them into a market where there's an offtake and there's a margin to be made in blending. So I think that's where it is a lack of experience in working with these different components that are now available for a blender to use versus where there was in high sulfur fuel.
Which makes an awful lot of sense. I suppose a follow-on question, but I'd probably like to push a little bit more towards Chris, and it's also talking a little bit about the sampling. Why is there such a difference in the way that people are performing samples? Again, is this a problem? Things are not clear enough, or they're not actually following what they're meant to be doing?
It's difficult to say. We used to call, if I go back in my youth, there was a program on the BBC called Blue Peter for children. And they used to make models, but because they didn't have enough time, they would make a little bit of the model. And then they say, well, here's one I made earlier. And sometimes I think in bunker sampling, some of the samples that are issued to the ship are ones that were made earlier. Perhaps that's due to lack of time or lack of interest in taking a proper sample at the time of delivery. In Singapore now, under the regulations, all samples have to be taken at the ship's manifold. And that appears to work. The rest of the industry around the world, the suppliers' terms generally say all samples should be taken at the barge. Doesn't say sometimes how, it says it will be issued by the barge. Well, so we run into a problem. I would love to see the point where all samples should be taken on board the ship, doesn't matter which port you're in, wherever you are. And there's a duty on the supplier to do that. That's the point of custody transfer at the ship's rail. And the issues of the insurance of the barge said, oh, well, people are not allowed to go up onto the ship, or problem, the ship's people can't get down onto the barge. Hey, look at how we're working today. We've got video, webcams. We could monitor this, make it part of the delivery procedures that ships must install if they want drip sampling at their manifold, real-time webcam or whatever. There can be no dispute then, not only the sampling, but also the pouring out of the samples after the sample's been collected and the sealing. This could be done.
I think it's an interesting point you made there, because I think that people outside of the industry would probably be quite shocked at the level of technology which is used within the industry. And while things are moving forward very, very quickly at the moment, we're still not very, very advanced. I believe Rustin was telling me the other day that he had a first video conference with a captain quite recently, which I think is, it must be very, very useful to have this kind of discussion, but at the same time, in some ways, it's quite surprising that it hasn't been done before. And think it's a perfect opportunity actually to move on to Caroline here. And you were talking about the clauses and helping your clients put their clauses into their contracts. And I am a strong believer in clear contracts, making sure that we have everyone knows what they're talking about. However, I'm a little bit nervous of just shifting blame. And we find that a little bit. I had the perfect example was we had these COVID clauses came out. Who was responsible for delays of vessels when they went into ports because of COVID, and Intertanko came out with a clause which basically said, okay, we've got the solution. Charter is responsible for everything. And okay, great, but nobody wants to sign it. And so then it's a question of saying, okay, can we have clauses which are, it's not just shifting the blame to the other party, because that's also the problem we have with our industry. We don't tend to think throughout the whole chain. We tend to think of our little bit and how do we protect our little segment and almost be damned with anyone else as long as we can get it accepted commercially. So maybe I'm leading a little bit, but I'd appreciate your comments on that.
Look, I agree with you. The prevention is better than cure. Okay, and where possible, yes. You want the clause in that's going to protect you, whoever you are, be you an owner, be you a charterer, whatever you're doing, you want to protect yourself. So you are going to look at the smaller picture because you're worried about your own bottom line at the end of the day. But what, as you correctly pointed out, what people don't tend to appreciate is you're just looking at your bottom line in terms of your contractual partner. What you're not appreciating is that there are other parties down the chain. So a claim can come up the chain and potentially bite you because it's not come through in the way that you expected it to from your contractual partner, because something else has happened down the chain. So you do have to look at the bigger picture. Now, yes, we do tout clauses to owners and charterers, which are very much in either owners or charterers' favor. And I always say to them, good luck getting it through commercial channels at the end. What I do is I often tell them, this is what I want you to have from a legal perspective. Now, nobody's going to agree to it. So let's see what we can do with it in order for you to have some chance of getting it through the commercial level, the chartering level, okay, and get your ship fixed. And, they're all focused on things like risk mitigation. We want to get the charter party clause right. We'll say have a look at the sampling that Chris talked about. And I would often tell them, you don't need to put this into your charter, but you're going to need to have a dedicated crew member every time you have a supply They all have mobile phones. Just get him to stand there and video it. Just hold the phone and video it. Just please do that. It is so simple. Any member of the crew can do it. You don't need to have your chief engineer or somebody doing that. Anybody can hold that phone and do that. And it would be a great help if they do it. Now, some owners, they've listened and they do it. Other owners have listened and they try to do it, and then their crew doesn't bother, you know. So that's a kind of a more practical concern as to the relationship that they have with their particular crew and how much their crew listen. I think if they do go and take a video of the actual supply, it can be very helpful down the line in terms of claims. Then there is the issue that Chris just pointed out now, where you have a supplier. The time bar under a supply contract is probably, you know, about what we call it, we tend to giggle and we say the 4 seconds, which what I actually mean, it's about 5 days, 7 days. The odd time you might get 14 days, but it's very tight, which is why we call it the 4 second. Whereas under your charter party, your time bar clause is completely different. So you can go potentially as an owner, go and claim against your charter, but then where is your charter in terms of his claim then against his supplier? He has not put his supplier on notice at the time. This is a time charter. The charterer is bunkers. So then the charterer is kind of the one who's stuck between a rock and a hard place. So we've seen a lot of pushback from the larger charterers who've gone along to larger bunker suppliers and said, okay, you want to do business with us? We're going to give you some pushback in terms of the time bar. You're going to have to increase that because this is not going to work for us. And things like that, you know, have been helpful. They've occurred on a commercial level, but they've led to better periods being seen on certain supply contracts, not all by any long shot, but on certain supply contracts, you'll see a decent time bar, which does give a party an opportunity to present a claim against the supplier. Now, what I always try to do is when I see an issue, for example, like the one I mentioned earlier, where, you know, one party is saying the fuel is on spec, one is saying it's off spec. Oh my gosh, what do we do? I always think in those kind of situations, because everybody really has the same goal, they want the ship to move. I always try to get the parties to talk to each other with a view to potentially having a third sample and the parties agreeing to be bound by the results of that third sample. And let's just get over the issue, get it dealt with quickly and move on and let the ship move. Everybody wants the ship to move at the end of the day and not to sit there. So I think every situation is kind of, you know, it's on its own merits, different clauses, you're in a different geographical area, you have a different supply contract, a different charter. So you have to look at each situation on its own. But in general terms, communication, in my opinion, is key.
I think that all those make an awful lot of sense. I think it gives us a good picture into how you go about advising the members of the UK Defence Club. I think it's interesting you mentioned that because we talk about contracts and we do spend a lot of time trying to make sure that our contracts, our charter parties are well worded. I fear that not enough companies spend enough time actually looking at the interaction between different contractual relationships that they have. And so essentially that might be the charter party, the supply contract with the bunker supplier. I see an awful lot between the charter party and the purchase and sale contract where it doesn't actually line up and connect. And also you say, let's just get the vessel moving. The number of times I've seen that the demurrage bill has ended up being more than the original claim. And that just ends up being very frustrating. It's just make a decision, go. And sometimes you have to cut your losses and go. Unfortunately, it's the case. There are 1,000,001 questions that I have for each of you three. In fact, I think it's been a very, very, very interesting discussion for me in particular, and I think also for our audience. I'd like to take this opportunity just to bring everything towards the end and ask you for your final thoughts. I will go in the same order as we started off. Caroline, please forgive me for you being the last on that order. But Rustin, let me pass it over to you for your final thoughts.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, as we come to the close of an eventful 2020, I mean, a lot of the things that have happened or were proposed to happen didn't happen. You know, we didn't see the collapse of high sulfur fuel into the nether regions. We saw a very tight high sulfur VLSFO market that continues to precipitate today. And the quality issues that have come up, they're coming up, and people are still learning how to deal with them, how to perform with them. I think as we look forward to 2030 and the initial challenges of decarbonization, what does that mean for fuel qualities and specs? I think there's going to be a lot of challenges coming forth as people look at different blends, different ways to start meeting decarbonization goals, and see what part technology plays in all this as well. I mean, it was announced yesterday that I think TECCO has developed a decarbonizing scrubber add-on. So maybe there is a mechanical solution versus changing the fuel slate of ships going in the forward curve, and we'll see how it adapts to this ever-changing regulatory environment that we're in. But we'll see how 2020 comes out, because I don't think anybody could have predicted how 2020 was going to be.
I think we all agree with you there, Rustin. Let's move on to Chris. What about you? Your final thoughts?
I think for the future, before I retire, maybe it could be possible that we come up with a standardized sampling process that helps the industry know. It wouldn't just help ship owners, it helps everybody. If you can rely on a sample, you can solve a problem. If you can't rely on a sample, why have it in the first place? I think there is insufficient testing in the supply chain. I think that could be improved. We're still seeing fuel supplied with sulfur just above the limit. That's the easiest thing to do, is to hit the sulfur target. There should be no reason why a fuel is supplied and when tested have a result above 0.50. That's just poor management. That's easy. The difficult bit is producing a fuel that has the right sulfur content, but is stable and good in every other way. And I think there may be in the supply chain a little lack of understanding of fuel technology, and certainly not enough testing. You shouldn't be relying on the ship owner to prove a fuel is fit or not. The supplier should take that responsibility. So there may be some slight changes to the international fuel standard, but I don't think it can ever fix everything. You can't put a whole list of things that shouldn't be in fuel into a standard. The key test is the fuel fit for use. Unfortunately, we can only use the engine sometimes to prove that. But I think this year, if we ignore the pandemic, on bunkers, it's been probably a little bit easier than the year before. And I hope that continues so that I can retire soon.
Excellent. Well, I think that's probably being a little bit optimistic, and certainly hoping to have an agreement on sampling before you retire. Maybe we could hope that there's one before I retire, but even that I think is probably being a little bit optimistic anyway. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to pass over to Caroline. How about you for your final thoughts?
Thank you. Before I say anything, I don't particularly want Chris to retire. He's excellent. So Chris, please don't retire. Please don't go anywhere anytime soon. So I think, in terms, I think of what the future has to hold, with the IMO regulations and sulfur, obviously we've seen more of an uptake in vessels putting scrubbers on. That's one aspect, which is a whole other subject. I'm obviously not going to go into that. I don't think the claims have come to an end, unfortunately, by any long shot. I wish they had, but they haven't. They've just changed the way they present themselves. As I mentioned at the beginning, more TSP claims. Then I think, was it Rustin that mentioned, or Chris that mentioned about the presence of jet fuel lately, which was correctly pointed out that has a lower flash point, and you can see a reduction in density, viscosity, and obviously when something has a lower flash point, it's easier to ignite the fuel, isn't it? So we're going to be watching that particular area quite carefully, and hopefully see less of it. as time moves on, and with the vaccination now out for COVID, people will hopefully start traveling again, and there may be less jet fuel available to blend. And that's it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Again, a number of points I'd love to have the time to ask you further questions on. It's interesting you mentioned about the jet fuel finding its way into the fuel oil, and obviously whenever we use fuel oil, we heat it up before it's used, and so you have to be very careful about this flashpoint. The number of issues that tie in together, because obviously with the COVID pandemic, it's more difficult to travel. So then potentially more difficult to have the right people in the right place when you want to take samples, but also when you are looking to do surveys for any kind of damage. It's interesting because there are measures which are being taken to try and specify crew, at least as key worker personnel, so that they can travel easier. I understand from Rustin, I mean, it's important, very important to work closely with your suppliers. I think it's a pleasure talking to someone from the ship owner side who obviously has such a clear knowledge of the fuel they use. I do have a suspicion that if all of the ship owners had people on board with such good knowledge of the particular fuels they use, then we'd potentially have a little bit less of the problems that we are facing. Also, sampling is a very important issue, and this is an issue across the whole industry, whether you're talking about bunkers, whether you're talking about commodities. It's the importance of actually knowing what we have bought and sold. And you touched on the point, it's the transfer of risk from one part to the other, transfer of ownership of the goods, in this case the bunkers. We have to be very careful on that. And clauses, we have to just make sure those clauses are clearer and clearer. I think there needs to be more industry cooperation. I think there needs to be more discussion between charterers. I would love to see a charterers association being created where there is essentially something along the lines of the ICS or Intertanko, or just creating a common pool of charters where they can come together and look at clauses and how these clauses work and have more of a unified position. I think the problems are becoming more complex. They're becoming more complex across the board, and so it's going to be, without doubt, very interesting going forward. As I said, that brings us towards the end of this video. I would like to say an enormous thank you to Rustin joining from Euronav, from Chris joining us from Brookes Bell, and Caroline from UK Defence. We are delighted to have UK Defence as a member of the Geneva Propeller Club, and very much hope that Rustin and Chris might bring Euronav and Brookes Bell on board at some point in the future. We are producing a number of different videos for the Propeller Club where we're looking into very relevant, timely problems that are being seen by the industry. And so please join us for our upcoming videos. And again, a final huge thank you to our guests today. Thank you very much.